Round 7 in Wijk aan Zee saw the clash of the world champions, Magnus Carlsen against Hou Yifan, the women's world champion. Now, over the past year, Yifan has played very well, but she came into Wijk aan Zee straight after university exams, and so far she hasn't had the best tournament. Magnus Carlsen, on the other hand, he successfully defended his world championship title, of course, and he's had the luxury of a winter break before coming into Wijk aan Zee, and he's starting to get into gear. Before this game he'd won 3 in a row. Let's see what happened in their game. We join the struggle after 24 moves. Now, Yifan has played, a solid but rather passive opening, the Kalashnikov, and you can see that Magnus has these 2 pawns here, and a very nice pawn chain, and that really clamps black down on this pawn on d6. And bishops were exchanged here, and that means that there's perhaps slight weakness to black's kingside as well. But I think the main thing is that just black is a little bit passive here, but it's very hard to crack black's position. Well, let's see what Magnus did. First of all, he played knight a4, attacking the queen, and the queen came back, hitting the e4 pawn, and the rook came over to defend it. Now, I think this idea with knight a4, this demonstrates one of white's possibilities, which is to break with c5. And after this pawn exchange, you can see that then black would have 2 isolated pawns, which are obviously much weaker. So black has to be careful. So Yifan just kept things solid with b6 that overprotects the c5 square. So the job having been done, the knight reroutes, and really Yifan can only wait in this position. She's shuffling her pieces around. And knight d3. So that's a nice redeployment of this knight. The knight looks at some very important squares in black's position, and e5 as well. And we can see how important it is that the knight is on d3, and what kind of influence it has. If black attempts to break out with b5, often this can be a useful move to break down white's pawn on c4. But here comes the trick, c5, and this is a big motif in the game. If knight takes pawn, then knight takes e5 wins material because of the pin, can't be captured. And if d takes c5, again there's a pin, and that's obviously wins material again. And if the rook comes across, white simply trades, and you can see white has been very successful there in breaking up black's pawn chain. So this is what Yifan has to be very careful about. Well, she played a5. Now, I have to say I'm not too keen on that move. It makes it much more difficult to play b5. I mean, we've just seen a case where it wasn't working, but it's perhaps nice for black to have that potential idea of b5. So it's going to be much more difficult, and it does leave at weak b5 square. So there we go, having provoked that little weakness, the knight spins round and comes round to this square c3, or potentially c3 anyway. Let's see. But I suppose the one positive thing about playing a5 is that it prevents b4, so the knight on c5 has some security. But still, I think it was a concession. But still, white needs to break through. Queen e1 played, and rook d8, so black is just shuffling around. So knight c3, yeah, we can see knight does a very good job controlling these squares, and with the knight here, it's going to be very, very difficult for black to get any kind of counterplay. And now it's time to turn to the king side. Now that Black is completely tied down in the centre and on the queen side. These breaks just aren't possible any longer. Then white can turn to the king side with a clear conscience. There's going to be no counterplay. So here we go. White switches, and you can see that with the rook here, it's very difficult for black's queen to rejoin the defence. So next rook swings across to the king side, or potentially swings across. And now rook g6, and this is already looking quite ominous for black. And there's a threat potentially to take on h6, so that's why the rook came up. And now, well, this isn't working because black has put both rooks on the 7th, and here the rook blocks. That's why the rook came to d7. So what does white do next? Okay, well, we can perhaps increase the pressure by shifting this knight round. So given a couple more moves, then knight takes h6 really will be the end. So rook f7, and that's a good defence, because if knight e3, then rook f6, and because of this pin, black will be able to exchange rooks, and that relieves some of the pressure. So Carlsen didn't want to allow rook f6, so instead drops the queen back. Good move. And this queen redeploys beautifully to the e3 square. So it's looking at this weak pawn on b6, but also that pawn on h6 potentially. That's why the rook came up to f4 to block this potential attack there. So, I mean, black could wait with queen b8, but, well, yeah, once the queen is dragged away from the king side, I think, well, you know, an idea like knight back to d3, pushing the rook away, and then I think things are going to be very nasty. So b5 was played, but b5 having been played, that means that c5 becomes a theme again, becomes a possibility. So for example, after pawn takes pawn, then, well, knight takes pawn would be this kind of standard move, but actually pawn takes pawn with the idea knight d3 and c5 is probably very, very strong for white. So rook f7, so Yifan is trying to find some kind of little bit of play here, perhaps force f3, which would weaken this diagonal. But c5 is very strong, so it's this same idea, trying to break up these pawns, and then e5 will be very weak. So for example, d takes c5, then knight d3, and, well, let's say queen here. Well, we can't take because the pawn fork would be nasty for white, but we take on e5, and once this knight enters the game, it is completely crushing. So queen c6, but this is already very, very difficult. For example, if rook takes e4, then, well, this forces checkmate actually, very simply here, and queen f8. So b4 tried by Yifan, trying to bring this knight into the game, perhaps, but this is desperate. I mean, white is in control here. So white is going to play the queen to h5 and just continue the attack. So rook h4, preventing that, and this is a good move, just forcing this exchange, so it means queen has returned to the king side, and now, you know, black's queen has to deal with the centre, can't switch back to the king side, so it's looking absolutely desperate for black. Knight b5, okay, Yifan is trying to bring this knight into play, but, well, here actually Magnus makes a slight error. Perhaps, well, there are a couple of ways to play. Perhaps the simplest is just to take on d6. And, okay, we have to watch out for this pawn, but still, after this, let's see, well, there's a trick here. For example, knight takes, we can take here, and then there's a knight fork on e5. And if the rook moves away, well, this is tremendous white. I mean, maybe that's the simplest way to play, but rook g4 is actually a slight mistake, because now knight c3, and, well, if pawn takes pawn, then there are some tricks here. Suddenly White's king is under a bit of pressure. So here, check, and actually Black is alright in that position. So Magnus has gone a bit wrong, but Yifan short of time, under a great deal of pressure, and here she misses her chance. She could have played this move, Queen takes e4. Incredible. The knight is threatened, but also Queen takes Rook, followed by Pawn takes Queen, and the best that White has is to play like this, and take here on d6, and then play knight e5. And okay, White has some advantage here, but Black has counterplay on the Queen side. But short of time, Yifan missed this and instead took on e4, and now this is fatal. Now Magnus is winning. Best is probably to take here, but then knight e5, and this ending really is very, very good for White. Pawn up, and these are going. Yifan tried knight takes f2, and after this, the idea, of course, is knight takes knight, queen takes with a pin. But instead, knight takes e5 is crushing. Of course, the pawn is pinned. One last trick, knight takes pawn. If this is taken, then again queen c5 check, but simple move, king h2 is the end. No more checks, no more sensible checks, and the queen is threatened, as well as the rook, as well as the knight, and that really is too much. So Yifan resigned. So that's 4 wins in a row for Magnus, and he's really powering through the tournament. So after 7 rounds, we have Ivanchuk and Carlsen in the lead with 5 out of 7. Ivanchuk drew a very long game today against Anish Giri. He was actually lucky to survive. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave is on 4.5 along with Wesley. So drew with Rajabov today. Vachier-Lagrave defeated Šarić. Ding is also on 4.5. He defeated poor Luc van Vely. Really, Ding was very lucky to win that one. Wojciech and Giri have 4 points. Wojciech lost to Bardur Jobava today in a wild game. Of course, it's Jobava. Of course, it's a wild game. So, yeah, I'm delighted that Bardur is back in contention. Well, he scored his first win anyway. So they play tomorrow, Sunday, and the pairings. Well, Jobava is playing Carlsen. That's going to be very interesting, and Ivanchuk is playing Wesley. So, thanks for watching.